All right, and welcome everyone to the Ginette Biro Podcast. I'm Ginette Biro, and I am absolutely thrilled to have this beautiful guest with me today. Dr. Amy Robbins is a clinical psychologist, a spiritual intuitive, a wellness speaker, and a host of a hugely successful podcast, Life, Death, and the Space Between. Dr. Robbins helps awaken and transform people by using the wisdom of death. And while there is a real sadness and grief around loss, Dr. Robbins makes death palpable yet approachable, and truly believes that by dissecting death from a psychological and spiritual perspective, we can start to really live life. And I love this. By starting with the end in mind and living life backwards, we can become more open, clear, conscious, calm, and connected to not only what is happening here, but also to our guidance from the other side. Dr. Robbins, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, for trading with me.
This is great. It's true because Dr. Robbins had me on her show, and we had a great conversation about all kinds of stuff in consciousness. And what I'm so excited about with having you here on the show is how you're really bridging spirituality and your own spiritual intuitiveness with your clinical psychologist side, and you're marrying the two. And I just think in our world today, you are such a bright light in doing that. It's fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been quite a journey for me to get here.
I can imagine. And so before we dive into that journey, tell everybody where you're from, a little bit about you, and then we're going to dive into what got you started in this.
So I live in Chicago. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work part-time, and I also have my podcast, which you talked about. I'm also a mom to 3 kids, 14, almost 12 and 7, daughter and 2 sons. So it has been a really fun year at home with them, especially, to a teenager and a preteen. But yeah, I have a dog, my husband. I mean, I just really, I volunteer a lot on school boards and just really invested in my family and my community, I think are kind of the pieces that I would describe, how I would describe myself. Those are things that are really important to me. And I think really important to me for a lot of the reasons that we're going to discuss in terms of like what matters in life.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Awesome. So let's talk about this. So you had, it was after the sudden and tragic death of your aunt that really kind of got you into discovering your whole spiritual journey. Is that right?
It actually discovered me. I don't think I
Oh,
discovered it. So,
okay.
uh, so my aunt passed away when I was 18 years old. She was diabetic. She had juvenile diabetes, had several stressors and events in her life that resulted in her ultimately needing a pancreas and kidney transplant. While she was waiting on the transplant list, one of the things that they had to do was make sure that her body would be strong enough to withstand the transplant. And when they were doing all the testing, they realized that it was not going to be. So her heart. They had realized that she had probably had several heart attacks that no one knew about. So they had to go in and repair her heart. When they went in to do that, she died on the table. They couldn't revive her heart. It had been so weakened from the stress and the diabetes that there was just nothing that they could do. She was 40. It's funny, every time I ask like my mom or her son, my cousin, everybody thinks she was a different age. She was between 47 and 49.
Right.
I think she was 48.
Yeah.
It's but which is crazy now as I start to approach that age to think about how young. I mean, she seemed so young to me at the time, but
Mm-hmm.
I think, I was 18. And so now as I'm approaching that age, just like, oh my God, she had so much more of life to live.
Yes.
And obviously this was horrible. I was in college. I had come home for a very short period of time and gone right back and really never fully grieved her loss, which was a tremendous loss, obviously,
Mhm.
for a number of reasons. My cousin lost his mother. My mom lost her sister and best friend, who was also like a second mother to me. My grandparents lost a child. I mean, there were so many different facets of this. I lost an aunt. It was really the first person in my life very close to me that was kind of out of order, that just turns your whole world upside down.
Yeah.
And so I had not thought about spirituality. It wasn't really in my my mirror anywhere, my rear view mirror, my forward look facing mirror. I had always been kind of curious and toyed around with like Ouija boards as a kid, but nothing near what my experience was about 5 or 6 years after she died, right before my cousin was getting ready to get married. And I was in a sleep state. I had woken up and fallen back asleep
Mhm.
and had what I now know was a visit. She came to me. It was very, very vivid. She showed me a image of my mom standing at the kitchen sink talking to her, saying, and my aunt said to me, tell your mom I'm going to be at the wedding. It's okay. She doesn't need to be upset. I will be there. And then she showed me another image of her listening to my uncle and he was outside running and pushing a stroller. I had a young cousin at the time when she passed. And he said, and tell Uncle Richie that every time he talks to me when he's outside running, I hear him and I know he's talking to me.
Yeah.
So so I wake up and I turn to my husband and I say, I feel like I just talked to Aunt Linda. She was here. And as this happens simultaneously, my dog starts barking because it's early. It's like at that, 6 a.m. time,
Mhm.
that twilight hour where you wake up, you fall back asleep. And I call my mom immediately and I said, Mom, I had this weird experience. I'm not sure if it was a dream or it didn't feel like a dream, but I didn't have words at that time to describe any more than that. And I said, she wanted me to tell you, she showed me you were at the kitchen sink and she wanted me to tell you not to be upset. She's going to be at the wedding. And my mom started crying and she said, I was standing at the kitchen sink last night crying while I was loading the dishes, talking to her, saying, saying, I can't believe you're not going to be at the wedding.
Amazing.
And so when I say I didn't find it, it found me. This was the beginning of an opening and really an awakening for me of
Mhm.
contact and connecting with and opening up to the possibility that there could be so much more
Mhm.
than when we die, that's it, our life is over,
Yeah.
as we know it.
Yeah. And so then, like, that's beautiful, and I love how that just happened to you. And at this point, so this couple of years after, you were probably already heavy into your studies in the very clinical sense, right?
Yes. Yeah. It
Yeah.
was
So
my first year or second year of grad school.
okay, so did that really kind of rock your perception of psychology, or did you find you could grasp both and blend it right away? Like, was there a contradiction?
Yeah. So it's been honestly a journey of 20 plus years that I finally feel like I'm at the place where I can understand how the two fit together.
Mm,
And I luckily had a professor at the time who was very, very grounded in psychological, psychoanalytic, and psychodynamic psychotherapy, which is the traditions that came out of Freud. But she was also very intuitive and into indigenous healing practices. So when I shared this with her, she gave me books to read. And
mm,
she said, I think you might be onto something here. I think you need to pursue this a little bit. And I didn't at the time because I was knee deep in grad school. And I wish I would have now, like looking back, I wish I would
mhm,
have pursued that more because I think it would have definitely shaped my clinical experience differently.
mhm,
But times were really different back then. Now there's so much more accessibility to this information. There's people
mhm.
talking about it. Then it felt really shameful. And I was nervous to share it with people because I didn't want any of my professors. I mean, I am working in the world of clinical psychology and diagnoses. And how do you talk about this without seeming like you have perhaps some really severe psychosis or psychological disorder? And not necessarily that specific experience, but certainly when I started having more visits from my loved ones and then patient loved ones where I was clearly getting information for patients to give to them that I didn't feel comfortable giving
Mhm.
because that's not why they were coming to me.
Yeah, right.
And so that's when I really went on the journey of, okay, what do I do now? How do I integrate this? I started seeing past lives of patients and wondering, what does this all mean? How can I bring this to them in a way that they can take in and digest? Because, it's sort of like feeding a baby bird out of a dropper. Like I couldn't say, hey, I think you had a past life of this, because that's not why they were coming to me. And many of my patients who come to me have come from the referrals of doctors, MDs at Northwestern University. So then how does that look, right? Like I'm,
Yeah.
who'd you send me to? So I really was very nervous about sharing this part of myself, because it's my livelihood. I didn't want to lose that. I didn't want people turning away from me because they thought, one, I was going to push this belief system onto them, because I think it was a very special and sacred journey for me. And so all I want to do is open people up to the possibility, but not say that that has to be your truth, because I don't believe that to be the case.
Yeah. Right. That's really interesting. So really, you have been, in a sense, at the forefront or pioneer of bridging these two worlds then, right? Maybe you don't want to take that label,
Yeah.
but coming from where you've come from and to where we are today, because I can even say, like, in the last decade, I've noticed the big change in even the spiritual world of being able to talk about mediums. And now you talk about a medium or messages or spirits, and it's not as taboo. And for you to now be in a place of merging it openly in your practice, like, that's really putting you at the forefront, I think.
Yeah, I don't think of it that way, but I could see. I mean, I think had I really come out years ago, it would have put me there. Now I sort of feel like, yeah, there's a lot of people talking about this now, a lot of people doing this now. And I don't use it in my practice per se. I mean, I think I use my intuition, certainly, right? I try to listen to, okay, what is this? Why am I feeling like I need to ask this question now? What is that about? And often it will get validated by the patient, like, oh my gosh, yes, that is exactly what I needed to hear. Or, oh yeah, you're so right about that. But sometimes I think that's just a good therapist too, right? And so it's like, how do you start to separate these pieces out? I don't know that you can. I think when you're really tapped into your intuition, to your soul, and to your higher self, then it's so aligned and unified that it doesn't necessarily feel anymore like it comes out from something outside of yourself.
That's a beautiful statement. And, I wish I would have had that explanation the other day. My husband was like, well, what do you feel about this? And I'm like, well, I don't know. I'm like, spirit kind of like turned me off just for a couple of days. Like they just like, it was almost like being unhooked. Right. But it was a beautiful break. Like, it was just nice to not have the noise. He's like, well, what do you think about this? What's your feel? I'm like, well, I don't really know, because I'm used to having the flow. So I'm like, I don't know. And it's exactly what you said. Like, it just becomes this innate piece that just runs through us. And it's not really one or the other.
But I know when it's not running through me, because like, to your point, like I know when I'm feeling more anxious or more human sort of feelings that aren't really comfortable. That's when I'm like, gosh, I'm really must be disconnected, and I'm not in alignment. And so what do I need to do to move myself back into alignment? And often that is not sit in meditation and connect with spirit. It is often, God, I need to cut back on, how much I'm volunteering. I need to cut back on my kids' activities. I need to not be running around like a chicken with my head cut off, because that makes me anxious. And that anxiety does not allow me to be in alignment with my soul and my higher self.
Yeah. What a great point. Hey, totally great point. And it's funny too, because sometimes those are the hardest times to meditate, right? Like when there's so much external noise, you can't just sit and meditate, because you do have to run here, do this, do that, do this. Right. So yeah, it's like scaling back, like you're saying. I think that's beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, I try to pay attention to those pieces of myself, the psychological pieces, really. Like, when am I feeling anxious, scared, sad, overwhelmed, to let me know I've fallen out of alignment.
Beautiful. So I want to jump to the question. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, and the reason why is, so I had my NDE, my near-death experience, which gave me a different perspective here, but not everybody gets an NDE, right? But you have this passion to talk about what the end of life can tell us about now. right? So can you explain a little bit about that? Like how people can embrace that idea, having not had an experience? Like, what do you feel?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think a lot of people have intense death anxiety.
Mm.
So there are, interestingly, death meditations out there that can walk you to that point to
Oh,
help you fear death less. And I think talking about death is useful. And death is happening all the time around us. I mean, especially this year, right?
mhm.
But in life, in nature, in seasons, there's always things being born and things dying. And when we see this on a spectrum, I don't think it's quite as scary. Now, one of the things I always say is I'm not ready to die now. I don't want to die. There's a lot of living I still want to do, but keeping that notion, that contemplative thought of at any moment, this could be it for me, really helps me to frame how I want to live. So I don't think, I mean, you had a near death experience, which gave you this amazing view of what happens on the other side. It opened you up, it opened up your consciousness to this ability to connect. But I don't know that we need to have that in order to achieve that. I mean, you're able to access things that other people might not be able to because you had this spontaneous experience,
Mhm.
or not, they might not be able to, they might have to work at it differently
Mhm.
in order to access it.
Mhm. Yeah, that's fair. So what would you say? So I liked your thought of the death meditations and stuff. That's really interesting. What else would you say? So, because I've met some people that are just so acutely terrified of death, talking about it, they can't even go there, can't talk about it, can't whatever. What would be some of the steps you would recommend that people can take to explore that or to kind of unwind the tense nature of it?
Well, first of all, I mean, with death anxiety, I don't do this type of work, but there is specific exposure therapy. So you can start to expose, I mean, if the anxiety is so gripping that people can't function, you can start to expose them to death. Just like you would do any type of exposure therapy, where if you
Mhm.
have a fear of flying, right, you watch airplanes, and then you go to the airport and you watch people board planes, and
Mhm.
then maybe you go onto the plane and you talk to the pilot, and then you come off, and then ultimately you fly. And
Mhm.
it's different because we cannot literally die and come back
Mhm.
purposefully, right? Like you
Mhm.
had that experience, but we wouldn't induce that. But you can bring people to the point of these experiences. You can talk about death. By talking about death, I
Mhm.
believe you can reduce the anxiety around it, because you start to help people learn to tolerate the feelings that they're having simultaneously while they're talking about it. And I
Mhm.
want to understand, what are you so scared of? Like, when you say you're scared of death, are you scared of the actual physical act of dying? Are you scared of what it would do to the people you leave behind? Are you scared of what's going to happen once you're dead? What do you believe about what happens once you're dead?
Mhm.
So all of those things that people don't think about because it's too painful. What will it mean if I'm not here? I don't know. Only you can tell me that.
Yeah.
I have my own belief and my own version of that story, but everybody has their own version to that story. And
Mhm.
so what I would do as a therapist is I really want to understand, what is the story you're telling yourself about what it means to die?
Mm. Mhm. And then unpack that, right? And see where you can modify or change the narrative of those
Exactly.
aspects. Yeah.
And I think that oftentimes it's about not living,
Mm.
this fear of this unlived life.
Yeah, right. That's an interesting point. And I love that that's why in the world today, I mean, at least in my perspective of the world today, more people are focusing on ideas of living now, right? Like the value of that thought. So that's a great point that you mentioned that. I really like that. Um, Now to jump to one other thing here too, within your podcast. So your podcast is called Life, Death, and the Space in Between. Can you talk a little bit more about that space in between and what that truly means?
I'm curious what it means. I'm going to turn the question on you. I'll
Okay.
answer the question and then
Sure.
I'll ask
Yeah.
what it means to you. So it's interesting because it means so many things to me at this point.
Mhm.
When I initially came up with the name, it was supposed to be just the space between. And literally a week before I was ready to drop the podcast, I don't know why, I had never thought to search podcasts with the space between. And there were like 20 other podcasts that had that title. And I was like, oh no, what do I do?
Right.
So I reached out to a friend and she helped me. And she was like, call it Life, Death, and the Space Between. And I was like, perfect. But for me, it was about, I felt like I was living for so long in this space between psychology and spirituality, which I think should not be separated. You cannot, I was talking with my healer yesterday and I was like, you can't have psychology without spirituality and you can't have spirituality without psychology.
No,
So
absolutely.
yeah, so there isn't necessarily a space between, but for so long it felt to me like there was. So it's about bridging that. And I also think about it as when you're in meditation and you sort of hit that sweet spot that feels like it's this in-between space where you're
Mhm.
no longer necessarily like in your physical body here, but you're sort of in this blissful space between here and the other side.
Mhm.
I think of it as the space between death and what comes next. Like, what is that space?
Mhm.
So for me, it's multi-layered.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. And when I like you said, what do I think about that? Right away, what I went to was exactly what your last point was, where here we are on 3D world, busy doing life, and then there's spirit on the other side, busy doing their life, life and death. But there is this space in between of like consciousness, of being conscious of what you're doing here, conscious of what is there, and making the most of this time between when you're born and when you die, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like being consciously available to make the most of this experience so that when you are on your deathbed, as they say, right, your last moments, you're looking back thinking, yeah, I have no regret. Like I
Right.
have no regret, like the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the beautiful. I love it all because I have this
Mm-hmm.
full book, this full backpack of who I've become now because of it. Right.
Well, and like the space between life and death, and then the space between death and life
Mm,
again, right? Like, what do you think about reincarnation? Because if you're coming back, there's also that space on the other side of death and coming back to birth.
yeah,
So
absolutely. Yeah,
it's a
absolutely.
fun idea to just play around with.
It is, right? It absolutely is. So listen, I want to ask you one more question before we wrap this up, and then
Yeah,
I talk to you all day long.
I know. I know. That's why we had to do this again, because we had such a great
Right?
conversation and connection the first time.
True.
And then I was like, oh my gosh,
Yeah,
got to do
right?
this more.
Totally. Okay, so what would you say to those that are really stuck in the science mind of things, like those that are either that have a I'm just going to call it a science background, that if it's not proven, it's not real. Spirituality can't be real, or mediumship can't be real, or intuition can't be real because it's not proven. Da, da, da. What would you say from that mindset as an invitation for them to explore what could be?
I mean, first we could start with what is real, right?
Ooh,
Right.
that's a
And
good
that's
one.
that like esoteric existential question of what is
Mhm,
reality.
mhm,
But I think there is a lot of data out there. There's a lot of support for these experiences. I mean, near-death experiences have been researched by some great minds. Bruce Grayson at the University of Virginia Perceptual Studies is researching this. I just spoke with a doctor yesterday at Yale, a psychiatrist who's working with a medium. Okay. They're
mm,
doing research
beautiful.
together to understand consciousness, to understand how people, and he's looking at through the lens of schizophrenia research.
Interesting.
So there are scientists who are studying this. The Winbridge Institute, who researches mediums and looks at their levels of consciousness out.
Mhm,
Dr. Gary Schwartz at University of Arizona. There are lots of scientific minded people who are researching and trying to understand what we only know. I think it's like we only use 10% of our brain. It might even be smaller than that. So
mhm,
there's a lot of stuff we don't know. And I just want to encourage people to be curious.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to believe it, but I think that an open, curious mind is the best mind to have, because and I would question people like, why are you so sure? Why are you so sure that it isn't possible?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that really shuts things down and shuts off conversations. And I think that that's in any conversation we have. It's like, why are you so sure that that is the way it has to be?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you can be open and think about, well, what if this was a possibility? What might that mean for humanity? What might that mean for how we live our lives? What might that mean for how we interact with one another?
Mm-hmm.
What might that mean for consciousness and the state of our world? My gosh, it would be amazing if people could embrace this notion.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I talked when I recorded my podcast about what are guides and what are guides from the other side saying about this time, this epic, what feels like a real epic time in the course of history, certainly in the history that I've lived, which is not that long, but and how are we embracing what should be an opening and expansiveness of an expansive consciousness?
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I love that answer. And I love it, especially coming from your perspective, because it carries some weight based on your educational background. Versus sometimes people will be like, well, what is your credibility behind it? Right? How can you say this? How can you say this? And so I love that you have knowledge of these different studies that are going on. The fact that they're connecting with mediums to study that. Like, I've always wanted someone to literally put like somehow scan my brain when I'm channeling to see what it does. Because I've heard interesting things about apparently what they've found, and I would love to see that. So I love that they're already doing that in many different ways to bring tangibility, data, like you said, actual data to support it now.
Yeah. And look, people can do whatever they want, but I encourage people not to just dismiss, oh, that's not possible, or, oh, that's crazy, right? We hear that a lot. That's just crazy. Why?
Beautiful. I love that. And you know what? I want to leave it on that note, because I think that's awesome. It's like, well, why? Dun, 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 right?
What comes next?
I know. It's great. Well, thank you so much for sharing some time with me and all the listeners today to just share your opinions and expertise. I think it's beautiful. I would love to have you back. Absolutely, to dive into more of this kind of stuff.
Anytime. It's my favorite thing to talk about. So I would love to come back. And self-plug, shameless self-promotion.
Yeah.
But I've interviewed a lot of these researchers on my podcast, because it's really important to me to have people who are well credentialed, who are doing this work, who have been doing this work, who are researching and really trying to understand. I was joking with the folks at Yale yesterday, and I was like, gosh, I am 20 years too late. Like, if I had been in grad school now, I would run your lab, because I want to know. And it was fascinating, because we were having this conversation about the medium is talking about how her spirit guides pushed her to call the psychiatrist. And I'm like, this is like a meme. This is like a crazy meme. Like, what did the psychiatrist say to the medium about her spirit guides, right?
Totally.
But it's happening, and it's exciting.
Oh, I love that. That's awesome. So I will post your links and stuff underneath in the comments and the notes of the podcast here. And just, again, everyone, if you want to listen to a really beautiful, well-established podcast, it is Dr. Amy Robbins, and it's called Life, Death, and the Space in Between. You won't be disappointed. It's totally worth it. So thank you again. And for those of you that want to connect with me, please do so on avalonspirit.com. There's lots of stuff there for different courses and insight. And we'll be back more next week with some more cool stuff to share.